And it looks like we are live and on the air now. For the folks that have already joined us, hang tight. We'll start right at the 1 o'clock mark. We're happy you're here. Thanks for joining us. And we've got 1 minute left to go live. Stick with us. We're glad you're here. Good afternoon and welcome to the PI Education monthly webinar for March 2018. Disclaimers, we are not attorneys. We are not offering legal advice. When you have legal questions, hire an attorney. This is the PI Education monthly webinar for March 2018. I'm Hal Humphreys, your host. Today, we're going to be talking about surveillance, avoiding the burn, and books. PI Education offers these monthly webinars every month on the fourth Thursday of the month. They're free, they're informative, they're a way for you to get to know us and for us to get to know you. We're glad you're here. A little bit about the structure of this webinar. We'll take a break at about the halfway point and shamelessly plug some of our educational offerings. There's a promo code in it for you, so stay with us. When we're nearing the end of the webinar, I'm going to ask Scott Fulmer, our guest, if he doesn't mind, to share a little bit about his new book, Confessions of a Private Eye. We're joined today by Scott Fulmer. He's an investigator out of Utah, though he works all over the place. I think he's joining us from Denver today. Scott owns his own PI firm. He's a superb investigator. Scott has worked his way into the world of influencers in this industry. He's an author. He blogs regularly. He's all over social media with useful information. He's written for Pursuit magazine, which I'm pretty sure is one of his proudest moments. Scott has opinions, and I love that about him. He weighs in on threads with thoughtful and insightful posts. Follow him on Facebook if you get a chance. He's also on Twitter. His Twitter hashtag or his Twitter tag is @Fulmer_PI. You should follow him there. A lot of good stuff going on there. I've never met Scott in person, but he's such an interesting guy. I can't wait to. I'm thrilled to introduce you to our guest for the March PI Education webinar, Mr. Scott Fulmer. Scott, do you mind to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, certainly. Thank you, Hal, for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. I'm originally from San Antonio, Texas. I've been a private investigator for almost 30 years and have owned investigation companies in Texas, Missouri, and now in Utah, where I'm pretty much going to stay. And have done primarily surveillance, all aspects of surveillance, workers' comp, insurance, domestic, that type of thing. I have a degree in criminal justice, criminal justice from the University of Texas at San Antonio, and I'm also a veteran of the Gulf War.
Well, I did not know those two things about you, and that's pretty entertaining. University of Texas at Austin, you say?
At San Antonio.
San Antonio, okay.
Yeah, not to be confused.
Okay, yeah, no doubt. That's the hook 'em horns guy.
They would be very upset about that, yeah.
And you served in the U.S. Army, is that correct?
I'm sorry?
you served in the U.S. Army. Is that
I
correct?
did. In fact, we were talking about, I was stationed there at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, which is north of where you are right now, and also served down in Fort Hood, Texas. And then the Army, in its infinite wisdom, invited me to join them in the Gulf War, so I couldn't say no. And spent some time over there. And after I got out, went back to San Antonio, finished my degree, and got into the private investigation field.
That's awesome. So you've been a private investigator for quite some time now.
Yes.
Roughly how many years?
About 26, 27 years.
All right. So that makes you one of the more experienced PIs around. I started my PI business about 10 years ago. And you know, it's a crazy business we work in. You know, one of the things that entertains me about this work is there's so many different things you can do as a private investigator. There's
Sure.
criminal defense work, there's surveillance work, there's domestic dispute works, you know, stuff like that. What is your favorite kind of work to do as a private investigator?
You know, if you're smart, and I don't know that I am, but if you're smart, you want to specialize in a niche and really serve one particular, get really good at one particular type of service. And, I did that in Texas for quite some time. And it's very, very competitive. Texas is like New York or California or Florida. There are many, many private investigators. And so it's a really competitive business there. And so that's one of the reasons for the move to Utah several years ago. I personally enjoy surveillance. I enjoy background investigations, trying to come up with information on someone. And with the market that I'm in, which covers the Intermountain West, Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, not a whole lot of people. It's a big area, square mileage wise, but I get to do a little bit of everything. And that's kind of what I like. I like to dabble in a little bit of everything, which is probably not recommended for success, but it's worked for me.
I think one of the things that I've found talking to PIs around the country is it's great to have a niche that is your thing that you're known for, such as surveillance, or for me, criminal defense, or for my friend Brian Willingham, it's due diligence, background investigations. It's great to have a niche that you kind of put out in front of things. But as investigators, as self-employed people, most of us are, we got to kind of strike while the iron is hot. So if a surveillance job comes in, that is a big surveillance job, if I have the time to do it, I'll take it. And I like that kind of work. And that's what we're going to talk about today is surveillance for private investigators. And I think a lot of people, especially newer investigators, have some misconceptions about surveillance and how it actually works. So one of the things I was hoping to do today is just kind of walk our way through several scenarios and several situations and kind of how you prepare for and the kit that you carry, the things that you arrange ahead of time so that you're going to have a better chance at success on a surveillance job. So first off, let's talk about rural surveillances. I live in Tennessee, and a lot of times when I do surveillance work, it ends up being out in the sticks, out in the tules. And there are some things that you have to think about before you roll off into the woods to do a surveillance. What are the things that you gather together before you head out to do a rural surveillance?
Well, I think rural surveillance is probably one of the most difficult types of surveillance to conduct, primarily because depending on the client, clients typically do not want to pay for more than one investigator. And so you're often by yourself. If you're lucky, maybe you have a second investigator that works with you. But I think a lot of the preparation, for me at least, begins before I even go out there. If possible, I will do a kind of a pre-surveillance drive-by to check out the neighborhood in person during the daylight hours to see what's what. Now, I also use Google Maps and Google Earth and check out the whole area to kind of get an idea. If I'm living there, I try to put myself in the mind of the individual who lives there, the subject. If they're living there, where am I gonna, what route do I take to the grocery store? What route do I take to the nearest school? How do I get my kids to school? How do I get to the convenience store? And people are creatures of habit, and so they take the simplest or easiest route typically. And so I try to get an idea of where they are, the lay of the land, so to speak, and where they would go, so that you have an idea. Because a lot of times in rural surveillance, you can't get up close. You're going to be taking what we call an indirect route. You're going to be down the road a bit. And I also, of course, run through social media as well as proprietary databases to get a good look at the individual, look at their lifestyle, vehicles that they have, because sometimes you go out there and the house is, a mile off the beaten path, and all you have is a driveway. And so those are some of the things I do to kind of give me an idea of and prepare myself for the surveillance.
Right. And when you're running your database searches, what database searches do you like to use?
Well, you definitely want to have more than one. If you have more than one database, it's you're kind of limiting yourself. So I've used pretty much used all of them, but these days I use Point, I use IDI Core, I use several other databases that are part of Utah databases for license plates, things like that, to prepare myself before I even go out there.
Right. When you're and just because I love them so much, I'm going to give a plug out to TLO, the guys over there. I've used them for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I like their product. I have not had a chance to check out Point. I've heard good things about it, so it's good to hear someone that's using that service. One of the things I do before I go out on a rural surveillance is and I'm a bit of a Luddite, but I like to get old school paper maps, and just kind of get my head around the area. So I'll get a paper map out
Right.
and kind of draw on the map, where the subject house is, those kind of things, just to kind of get my head in that 1,000-foot view of what the area looks like, where are the routes in and out of the neighborhood, if it's a neighborhood, those kind of things, and where are some potential places that I might rack up and sit for a surveillance job. I do some work here in Nashville with Michael Sands. He's one of our instructors at PI Education. And one of the things Michael does on rural surveillance, and I think this is brilliant, I've done it in the past and it works pretty well, is he has these flashing lights on his car and kind of road crew cones and different business placards that he can put on the outside of his car. And I found that when you do that, if you make up a fake name for a survey crew or something like that, people just don't even see you. Do you ever do anything like that?
I do, and typically with surveillance, you want to you don't want anything remarkable about your vehicle. You want to be totally to blend in. But when you're in a rural environment like that, you don't have much of a choice, because people in the country are nice. They want to help you. I knew a PI that would go out and park on the side of the road and put his hood up, which is nice. But then every time Dick and Harry would drive by and stop and talk to him and want to help him, and so it became a real distraction. But yeah, I certainly do things like that. I've got placards that indicate I'm doing surveying in the area or oil well inspection, something to that effect. I know we'll talk about suburban areas later, but in suburban areas, piano tuning, which is something that takes a long time, is also something that works well.
That's the first time I've heard piano tuning. I love it. That's awesome.
Yeah, it really, because it takes hours to properly tune a piano, and so people don't give it much thought. And in Utah, a lot of folks have pianos for some reason. But yeah, that's some of the things that I use to kind of try to blend into that rural environment out there.
Okay, let me ask you this. I've talked to several investigators that spend a lot of money on camouflage gear, ghillie suits, and stuff like that. Do you ever find yourself in a situation in a rural setting where you've hiked back up into the woods or up into the mountains or whatever, and you've got a good spot to do surveillance and you have to use camouflage? Do you ever do that? I've done that a few times. It's not something that I don't have a ghillie suit, so it's not something that I typically use. A lot of times is because you may be dealing with privacy issues or trespassing issues as you're gathering the evidence, and so that's something that's not going to help you if it ends up going to court. I did have a case in Missouri, Lake of the Ozarks, which is
It's south of Jefferson City, Missouri, the capital, and it's a really nice area with lots of lakes and rivers and water skiing, and people have these very expensive homes on the embankment of these lakes. And I followed a guy out there who was doing construction, and this is also in my book, which we'll talk about later. And he got down, I followed him down this rural road, and he gets down, and all I see are all these cars and trucks on the side of the road. And after I get out, I could hear hammering and nailing and things like that. And he was working on a house that was kind of down a hill in front of the lake. And so in one of those instances, I did kind of pass up the house a bit and then actually get down into it. And I could sit there and videotape him from the woods. I had a dog that was with him that came and checked me out. The dog was friendly. So it worked out okay.
That's one of the things about the idea of using camouflage like that. Number one, the trespass issues are real. I have been called out for trespassing. Turns out I wasn't. I knew I wasn't, but the person said I was. Another thing is when you have on camouflage and you're out in the field like that, and if a dog comes sniffing around or blows your cover out there and you get burned, you're kind of committed. You're out there,
Yes,
you're
you
out there
are.
hanging in the wind, and there's no way to say, oh, I was just taking a walk through the woods. You're in full camouflage. It can be dangerous.
I agree. Yes, definitely. That could be a problem. So yeah, I typically, when I did that surveillance, I was just dressed, like anybody else, and that way I could just, say I'm looking for a house or looking for a neighbor, or like you said, taking a walk in the woods.
So if you're at the Lake of the Ozarks and you're doing surveillance like that, and the house is on the embankment of the lake, have you ever had an occasion to use a kayak or a boat or something like that for surveillance?
That's interesting. I have not. I have never had an opportunity to do that. Would actually be ideal. I was at the tail end of the surveillance on that one, so we used the last bit of time on that guy there. But that would be a really great way to go about it.
One of the things that Michael Sands and I talked about a couple of years ago, we're working on updating the surveillance course for PI education, is doing surveillance from a boat. Michael lives up in Hendersonville, Tennessee, and there are a lot of lakes up there. And almost the entire shoreline is populated by, rather large homes that have boat docks and stuff like that. And that ended up being a really productive form of surveillance for him, is to get his kayak out and go out with a camera. And people just don't know. You got a fishing pole or whatever, and you just kind of blend in. Nobody notices you. So that's not a bad idea for surveillance. Rural surveillance is, like you said at the top of this, it's one of the most difficult forms of surveillance I've ever been involved in, just because the nosy neighbors, the farmer coming by trying to help you out, asking you questions, those kind of things. So when you're preparing your kit for rural surveillance, what items do you carry with you as far as gear for doing rural surveillance?
So I have, for lack of a better term, you could call it a go bag, which is essentially, I have different items in it depending on whether it's a rural surveillance or it's a urban surveillance, downtown Salt Lake City or in Denver. But of course, binoculars, some really good binoculars that can bring the person in pretty closely so I can see what's going on in the house, who's coming, who's leaving in the vehicle. One of the other things that's worked well for me is a lot of times in a rural surveillance, you may be down the road and the subject may be a quarter mile, or the subject's driveway may be a quarter mile away or half a mile away. And as you look down the road, of course, you see different driveways. And if you look back and forth at it again, you may be looking at the wrong driveway. And so what I've done is I have reflective tape, and I also have chem lights that I've just cracked open and thrown out there by the driveway, and nobody pays attention to them. And then when I'm sitting down the road, I can see the chem light, and I know that's the actual driveway that the subject's going to come out of. If it's daytime, I have a paintball gun, and I may shoot several orange or purple paintballs at a tree right there by the driveway, and that's also something that helps me to kind of get an idea of where I'm at, because as you know, you sit there after a while, all these trees and all these driveways, they all start to run together.
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. I'm sure you, as well as the 100 and something people that are in the class today, have watched at some point in your life the movie Chinatown.
A long time
And
ago.
there's a trick that Jake Gittes uses in that movie where he takes a really cheap dime store watch and he puts it underneath the wheel of a car. He sets it before he
Right.
leaves. And when the car leaves, it marks the time the car left. That's the paintball identification marker, the chem light identification marker. Those are great ideas and really useful information for folks that are doing rural surveillance. Those never crossed my mind. That's fantastic. Um, I had a surveillance a couple of years ago that was partial in the woods and partial in a small town outside of Nashville, which is not unusual. And I think that's probably fairly similar for folks around the country. Um, I had the go bag ready to go. I had all kinds of gear in there, handy cam, uh, still camera with a really long lens on it, binoculars, the whole business. At the end of the day, the one piece of equipment that I used the entire surveillance and presented in court was the iPhone. I used that and nothing else. I got all of the video, all of the photos using the iPhone. And I'm almost to the point in my surveillance life where that's all I'm going to carry out anymore.
Well, you wouldn't want to do that 10 years ago, but these cameras, and I carry an iPhone as well, and the cameras have just are fantastic compared to even a regular digital camera that you would buy at the store. I mean, they're really good. The
Yeah.
quality is amazing.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to approach it. And again, I had my entire kit in the car ready to go, but I got permission to be on a neighbor's property across from the school where the guy was dropping his kids off at school. And there's a little berm between the house and the road. And I was able to get on that berm and have my iPhone in landscape mode and get all of the evidence I needed. So for those of you out there that do surveillance, especially if you're new to the business, you don't necessarily have to go out and buy all of the expensive equipment. You can get by with an iPhone or an Android phone. Any kind of cell phone will work for that thing. The other thing about iPhones and cell phones in general is you can take a video while you're pretending to talk on the phone and nobody pays attention to you because everybody's on the phone these days. So little pro tip for you. So I think we may have beaten the dead horse of rural surveillance enough. Let's move on to suburban surveillance, and we'll start that one off with, if you just joined us, and I see that some folks have just joined. Scott was saying earlier that one of the disguises he uses for his car in suburban surveillance is piano tuning business, which is fantastic idea. So when you're getting ready for suburban surveillance, you're in a subdivision or something like that, Scott. What are the things you have to think about first when you first get the assignment? Let's just walk through the process the same way we did for rural surveillance. How do you approach it?
So I try to first gather as much information about the subject as I can. And, I look at the house. I look at where the house is in the neighborhood. If I live there, where would I depart the neighborhood? How would I go out of the neighborhood? Again, where's the school? Where's the nearest grocery store, the gym, the bank? Where's civilization, basically, if I live in that neighborhood? I look at the vehicles. What vehicles are registered to the subject? If the vehicle plate is historical or if it's current. A lot of people drive around with expired tags all the time, so it's no big deal to them. But I look at all that information, and I also, where possible, do a drive-by during the daytime hours, because you can look at the Google map, and then you come out to the neighborhood and you find out that the street is closed because they're putting pipes in, or the house that's next door that looks really nice has burned down, and you get a feel for the neighborhood and how they're paying attention to what's going on. And then I look for areas, depending on the time of the year and the weather, I look for good areas for surveillance. When I start a suburban surveillance, One, I typically hang back pretty far until I get an idea of how aware the subject is. And once I get an idea after following them and them coming and going, then I may move in a little bit closer to get some good video. You also want to pay attention to the neighborhood. You know, it's not enough just to sit there and, you know, turn your engine off and stare at the house. If there's someone whose yard is immaculate and they're always out there and they've got garden gnomes, they've got every device you could think of to water their lawn, they're anal retentive about everything. These are the kind of people that are always looking around and they're very careful. They understand if cars don't belong there. And so I try to avoid those types of houses. Sadly, it's been my experience that in poor neighborhoods, lower middle income and poor neighborhoods, people don't care. Most of them are renters. They're less attentive to what's going on, unless they're, you know, dealing drugs or breaking the law. Then they're very aware. And one of the times is this neighborhood that's got 3 million cars on the street, because then nobody knows, they don't know what's going on because there's so many cars there. And another one is, of course, during the holidays, if you're doing surveillance around Thanksgiving or the Christmas holidays, you've got people from out of town coming and going, and people more interested in their own lives than what's out on the street. So those are just some of the things that I do.
Okay, and then we've got one question coming in from the audience today. What is your favorite video camera for daytime surveillance, and what is your favorite video camera for nighttime surveillance? Those are good questions. Do you use the same camera for both, or do you have one that you like specifically for nighttime operations?
You know, I use the same camera, and I'll tell you why. I'm really a bit of a minimalist. I have one bag, and I use a lot of apps. I use my iPhone. I have a Covert camera that I use, which is a keychain alarm camera, which I find works in almost any situation. And I use a regular Sony camera, Handycam, to conduct surveillance. I have an iPad, which I use to write reports, and so I carry just a small amount of equipment to do what I need to do.
Okay. One of the things that I found when I first started work in the surveillance business, and when I started my company, I got my company license and my PI license at the same time. I knew I had absolutely no business going out trying to do surveillance on my own because I had no experience. So I worked with a private investigator who was kind enough to train me. And one of the things that struck me when I first started this business was, you think that you've been burned. Anytime anybody drives by, you think, oh my God, they've seen me. I'm burned.
That's right.
You know what I'm saying?
Oh, exactly.
The longer you're in the business, the more you realize people just don't notice by and large. And you can really tell, you can really tell when you've been burned because somebody's going to follow you around, or they're going to stop and just walk up to the car and say, what are you doing here? But most of the time people just don't pay attention.
No, I agree. I worked with a guy years ago, and his saying was, "You got to believe the voodoo. No matter what happens, just keep on going." And that's pretty much what my rule of thumb is. I just continue to roll until it becomes blatantly obvious. If anyone tells you they've never been burned, they're probably lying, or they haven't done a whole lot of surveillance. I mean, it happens to everybody. It's the nature of the business, and especially if you are conducting surveillance over the course of 5 or 6 days on a very active subject, there's more and more opportunity for them to just kind of suddenly realize you're the same guy they saw at Home Depot, and now why are you here at the convenience store?
Right.
And so you learn things. And speaking of learning surveillance, I'm a firm believer that really, you can read all the books you want, you can have people talk to you about it, but until you go out there and do it, that's really the best way to get experience. And you're gonna get burned. I mean, it's just the way it is.
I think it's the only way to learn surveillance techniques is to actually go out and do it. There are some courses at, like, I know the Nashville Community College at one point had a surveillance course, and they would actually take you out to the mall to do surveillance on a subject. And it was a good way for people to get their feet wet with that process of trying to follow someone. And here's the thing, guys, if you're a private investigator, and I think most of the folks in the audience are, As Scott said, everybody has been burned at some point or another. It happens. It just happens. The other thing is, you know, you can blend in any manner of ways. I know investigators that carry elaborate disguises to hide themselves from different people. But I Suburban Surveillance, I did one several years ago where we were at a bar, and in order to blend in, I ordered a really stiff whiskey drink, and I don't drink whiskey, but
Just to blend in.
I dipped my hands in the whiskey drink and kind of got that smell of whiskey on my beard and my hands. And as the subject and his girlfriend walked by, I was having a very loud conversation about nothing with the bartender, but I looked and smelled like a guy sitting at a bar for a long time. So there are a number of ways you can blend in these situations, and people by and large don't pay attention. And if they do, if you get burned, there are ways you can deal with it. You can let it cool off. You can switch it to another investigator. I think for Suburban Surveillance, and one of the things I hate about surveillance work is most of us, and Scott, you touched on this in the very first part of the hour, most of us work by ourselves. We're out there doing the surveillance alone. If you're in a car trying to follow someone through Nashville, Tennessee, where I live right now, you're going to lose them in traffic. It is impossible for one surveillance operative to follow someone in a car through Nashville, Tennessee without losing them. You can get caught in traffic. You're going to get stopped at a stoplight. And one of the things I would caution you as an investigator, don't think that you're going to get away with running a red light. Don't think you're going to get away with speeding. You might if you tell the police officer that you're a private investigator, but you probably won't. So you have to obey the traffic laws. You have to do these things. So it's very difficult for a solo operator to follow someone in a car. And you're the same guy over and over in a bar, in the grocery store, in a restaurant, at the childcare place, whatever. So those are some things to think about. Scott, we got another question from the audience. What do you do if you get approached by law enforcement? If you're out in the field doing surveillance and a cop comes up to you, what do you do?
So that has happened, of course. And you can also call into the police department and let them know you're doing surveillance in the area. If it's a really small town, I wouldn't recommend that because you're probably going to end up talking to one of the relatives of the or neighbors of the subject.
Or the husband.
If it's a really large town. Yeah, or the husband. If it's a large town like Denver or Nashville, they don't really care. And so the best success I've had in that is kind of a medium-sized, like Clarksville, Tennessee, kind of a medium-sized town that's not too small and not too large. And then whenever it's happened to me, it's happened after I've been on surveillance for a while, over the course of several days. And that's because someone's noticed my vehicle. And I just tell the law enforcement, I show them my ID, tell them who I am. And I basically tell them, and they never ask me why. They just, once they know I'm a private investigator, I show them my identification. They say, well, you should have called in. But if they pepper me with questions, then I typically tell them that I'm trying to catch up with a deadbeat dad, or if it's a female cop, they really like the deadbeat dad bit, or if it's a male cop, it's a deadbeat mother, to serve process, anything like that. Nothing about the actual case that I'm working. And then depending on where I'm set up, if that's been something that my subject could have seen or observed, and I'll probably leave the neighborhood and maybe come back in a different car a different day.
Right. Yeah, and that's another key that we'll get into in just a minute. We're going to take a minute now. It's right at the halfway mark, just a little bit past. You are in PI Education's monthly webinar for the month of March 2018. I'm Hal Humphreys, your host. I'm joined today by Scott Fulmer, a private investigator out of Utah. We're talking about surveillance, different scenarios, different ways to do surveillance, how to avoid getting burned as a surveillance operative. I promised you a promo code today. So the promo code for the day is Covert, one word, all lowercase. And if you go to pieducation.com, you select whatever class you would like to take from us, put it in your shopping cart, and then The promo code area, you can Covert, 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 and that will get you a 15% discount on any course you'd like to take from PI Education. I will say that our surveillance course is about to change. I like the current surveillance course a lot. It's useful. It's got some really good information in it. It may be rotating out of the schedule here in the next little bit, so it might be a good time to go take that course as a refresher. There's some really good information in there. And again, this is PI Education's monthly webinar, pieducation.com, and the promo code for the day is Covert. And I think Stephanie's going to leave that open until the end of the month. So you can get 15% off of your continuing education through the end of the month with the promo code Covert. Coming back to Scott Fulmer and our discussion about surveillance, we just had a comment from the audience, and this is a nefarious actor out in Texas by the name of Jason Addis. He's one of the best investigators I've ever met. I really like the guy. We've not actually worked together, but we've worked on similar cases. He says he subscribes to the gray man theory when working on surveillance jobs. He doesn't need to be invisible. He needs to be forgettable. And I think
I agree. Yeah.
Go ahead, Scott.
I was going to say you have to be nothing remarkable about you. You're not wearing a red shirt. You're not wearing a hat that is brand new or that people can notice. You just want to be forgettable. You don't want anyone to notice your vehicle that has damage to it, or you have an antenna array on top of your vehicle. Nothing about it should be noticeable.
That is one of my pet peeves in this business. And I know we've got a lot of former law enforcement in the business, and they do fantastic work. And I have several friends that are former law enforcement. One of the things that bugs me is when someone becomes a private investigator and they go out and get a Crown Vic and they put this array of antennae on the car and they look for all the world just like a cop car. It's like, guys, come on, think about this for a little bit. You don't want to stand out that much. One more thing before we continue. This webinar series is offered free here on YouTube for our patrons, for people that are fans of us. If you're in the webinar, we have a little over 100 people in the webinar today. Do me a favor. On the bottom right-hand side of the screen there where the video is playing, there's a subscribe button. Click on that. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. It helps us out to have you be a subscriber there. It doesn't cost you anything, but it does help us out a little bit. So subscribe to the YouTube channel and enjoy all of the videos we have on there. Going back to Scott Fulmer, and I apologize for that. Going back to Scott Fulmer. We just got a real quick question from someone. Do you ever plan on getting your podcast moving again?
What was that again?
Do you plan on getting your podcast going again?
I do, yeah. In fact, I'm very busy. I guess we're all very busy. And the podcast is a labor of love. I don't make any money doing it, and it takes time. But if they go to my website, which is fulmerpi.com, there is one episode of the podcast. I have started it back up. And in this particular episode, I'm speaking with a fellow named Michael McMahon. He is a professional counselor that interviews children. And so we talk a little bit about how to interview children. And then we end up, he's a friend of mine as well, so we end up yakking about the Netflix show Mindhunter, which we both really love.
I totally enjoyed that show. I sat there and binge watched it when I was on.
That's exactly what I did. So yeah, so to answer the question, yes, and it should be coming out on the 1st of every month.
Okay, good. That's great. That's good news. And that's, again, for the folks in the audience, one of the ways Scott has gotten himself into kind of the forefront of the PI industry as a thought leader, much like Brian Willingham does, much like Eli Rosenblatt does, much like Pursuit Magazine does, is he produces content and he shares his knowledge with the field, and that's what gets you out there in front of the business. So Scott, thank you for doing what you do, and thank you for being here. Got a quick question from the audience, and this is one that I get sometimes. I have gone back and forth on this issue. Tint or no tint?
I say no tint. No, I'm just kidding. I do use tint, and again, being a minimalist, you don't want to go, in my opinion, you do not want to go out and get Limo Tint and just call it a day. Limo Tint is typically too dark, not only for surveillance in the evening, late evening, or early morning, but it's also noticeable. Again, you're trying to be totally forgettable. And when you see a vehicle that has Limo Tint, what's the first thing you want to know? You want to know what's inside. And so everybody, walks up to it and tries to see inside. So typically what I do is the rear windows I tint heavily, not to any extent towards Limo Tint. And then the front driver and passenger side, I tint extremely lightly. I use a window shade in front of the windshield or behind the windshield. And that allows people to look out and see into my car. They can see into the driver's seat, or if they're close by, they can see it, and there's no one there. They can see, or they think there's no one there. They can see that no one's there, and so it makes them feel comfortable, and they move on. Which brings me to another thing. In almost all instances, not all of them, but in almost all instances, you really do not want to sit in the front seat of your vehicle. You want to be in the back.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that's one that I think I made that mistake several times when I first started in the business, sitting in the front seat, and I got the cops called on me a couple of times. The tent business, I don't know. I mean, the number of times I've had the cops called on me is kind of astonishing. Not just for surveillance work, but for other types of work that I've done.
It's the beard, probably.
It is. It scares people. I actually had a lady. I had a lady in Texas one time, and the description the cop gave me when he called me was, he goes, "This lady called and said she's got some big hairy guy knocking on her front door, pestering." I'm like, "Well, that would be me." There's no doubt about it. Yeah, it's the issue of tint for me is an interesting one. I love the idea of being in the car and having nobody be able to see me, but at the same time, you don't want to stick out like a sore thumb. And again, if you're in a Crown Vic or a Mercury Marauder and you've got the windows totally darked out, people aren't going to wonder what you're doing. They know what you're doing.
Well, and it also depends on where you're at. In some states, if you're in Arizona or Nevada or Utah, these states that are out, in desert areas or high desert areas, everybody and their mother has tint. In Texas, everybody has tint. And I don't know about some other states where Minnesota, where it's, you want the sun rays to come in. But so what I typically do, and what I do is use a combination of surveillance curtains and moderate amount of tint to allow a little bit of sun to come in. What you really want to do is you want people to be able to look at your car and be able to see maybe the shape of a headrest or whatnot, but not see your face.
Right.
Just dark enough so that they can't make it out.
Enough to make it look like it's an empty car. And the surveillance curtains, and again, for the folks in the audience, the tips we're talking about today are just kind of, I would like to call them common sense tips, but they're things that people don't think about a lot of times. The surveillance curtains, you can get blackout curtains. We've got them here in our office today. They're actually sold on Amazon as blackout curtains. You can get those fitted for your car to go between the front seat and the back seat. It does help to, like, for somebody walking by, if they're looking at the front seat, which is where most people look, it looks like the car's empty. So, the curtains are a good idea as well. Let's move on to kind of the idea of urban surveillance. And if you're in a city situation, I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and I've done some surveillance in downtown Nashville. I've done some surveillance in downtown Memphis. When you're in a downtown urban environment, things change. Parking becomes a real issue. You can't always park on the street. How do you approach an urban surveillance, Scott?
So, an urban surveillance has a lot of challenges similar to a rural surveillance, just kind of the opposite. You've got so many people coming and going. You've got a subject that may jump on a bus. They may take an Uber or a cab. And so you really have to be prepared for every kind of scenario. In this go bag that I carry, I have money. I carry, of course, my cell phone, water. I carry a rail pass, a tow pass, a bus pass, anything. So I'm prepared to follow the subject. Now, I followed if you follow someone that gets on a bus, if possible, you're really better off getting on the bus with them. Because the reason why is because as you follow them, if you're trying to follow a bus, of course, the bus drives very slowly. and buses always like to run red lights at the last minute. The buses start to, one after another, they start to look very similar. And so you can get to the point where you think the subject is going to get the bus, and the bus is empty, and you have no idea where your subject went. And so those are some of the things that I do.
And the reason you lost him is you didn't take your paintball gun out and shoot the bus with orange paint.
That's right. I should have done that.
We've got a question.
But no,
No, go ahead.
No, that's right. Go ahead.
We got a question from the audience, and I think this is one that may be on a lot of people's minds. This is from Mauricio. I would love to hear Scott's thoughts on the current demand for surveillance investigators in the insurance industry as companies move towards in-house investigators.
So that's a good question. They're all good questions, of course. And I mean, you could do a whole webinar basically on just that topic, I think. But there will always be a demand for someone who is technically proficient in surveillance. That's my belief. And not only do you have that situation with in-house, because I know several insurance companies have done that, but you also have companies that are going to video cameras, security cameras that are monitored, and then they just call the police out, that type of thing. But I think that, and this is one of the reasons why I moved to a smaller market here in Utah, because it takes a while for everything to kind of catch up with it here. But I think that there will always be a need. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think there's always going to be a need for that. I think one of the trends right now is that, and it's not necessarily an old trend. There was a company, I think it was Baron Risk, probably 15 years ago, that went to an in-house group for a while, and then they kind of went back to contracting the work out due to the cost. And so if you're able to streamline, if you're able to offer your clients next day video, if you're able to offer them the ability to log into a database and find out what's going on and read reports and stream their video, then you're going to be in a lower position to compete against these types of companies.
Okay. And I think there's probably a large number of folks that are worried, and I've had a number of careers over the years, one of which was in the kind of real estate consulting business, and a lot of the people in the real estate appraisal business are terrified because they feel like their work is going away and they're not necessary anymore and stuff like that. I think for the private investigator set, there are a couple things that a good surveillance operative absolutely has to have. Number one is the ability to be the gray man, be forgettable, be the guy that nobody really notices. Number two is, once you've gotten the information, once you've gotten the evidence, you've got to be able to sit in a courtroom in the witness stand and answer questions in a reasonable manner, and do it in a way that is not like, I'm doing this for this side. It's just like, I'm an independent third party. I was hired to do this job. I saw this guy doing this on this date, and this date, and just kind of articulate the facts. But you've got to be able to present yourself well.
Yeah, you do. And the other thing I would say is that the business is very competitive. And if I've learned anything, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You don't want to have just one client or just two clients that you bill 90% of your work to. You don't want to offer just one product, because you're going to end up, in the unemployment line, because things change over time.
Right. One of the questions we just got from the field is, do you use any video processing software to produce a final video? Or do you just burn a disk of all the clips? And this is a pretty good question, because when you're dealing with video that you've obtained, there are two ways to prove that. Number one is it's date and time stamped, blah, blah, blah. Number two is you can say on the stand, I took this video on this day and time. Both of those work. But if the video has been edited, sometimes people will try and make that a problem. How do you deal with that?
Well, it can be a problem, and I think that the courts, I know the federal court is ahead of everybody on this matter, in accepting digital evidence. But sometimes the courts, depending on where you're at, are not in tune with how you do your business and what goes on. I'm a bit of a Mac freak. I'm a total Apple freak, iPhone, iPad, MacBook, and I used to wrestle with I used to use a regular PC, and I would wrestle with all these cables and using one of those devices to capture the video with the time and date stamp, and then it would really downgrade the quality of the video, which you don't want. And then for some odd reason, all these companies like Sony, they don't really care about having the video, the time and date stamp on the video. They just want to just sell you a great camera. And but ever since going to Mac, I use Final Cut Pro, and yes, it does give you an opportunity to mess things up, to edit it. But when you go on the stand, you just basically you have to make sure that you provide all the video, all of it, to the client. And then if you have to testify in court, you're basically testifying to or proving the video, saying I shot it, like you said, I shot the video on such and such day. I didn't edit it. And some lawyers, in fact, may want an edited version. I had a guy in another state, and this guy, I got him. He was one of those the guys that climbs up the tree, that saw the branches out. I mean, it had a hook and ladder and the harness, and he would rappel up and rappel down, and had a chainsaw hanging and a saw and everything. And he had a specific injury, and I got about an hour video of him just doing his thing. He's supposed to be on workers' comp. And I almost had to go to court in that, but the video was so convincing that they ended up settling. But the lawyer wanted an edited version of the video because he figured no one wants to sit there for an hour straight and watch all that. And so I made sure to provide him an edited copy of all the good parts, and then provide him the full video as well, and make sure that he knew, because a lot of times you have to educate your clients. I make sure that he knew that he needs to let the judge and let the court know that this particular video is just an edited version, and here's the full video for evidentiary purposes.
Right. And I had a case several years ago where we were documenting a lady who was at home with the kids over the weekend using drugs, and we had, I don't know, 36 hours worth of video at the end of the weekend. Wow.
Man.
And I think 76 discrete instances of her walking out back and hitting the pipe. So what the lawyer asked for was what we called a highlights reel. And we just went down, and even one version of the video, it ended up being like 5 minutes long. It was just like her hitting the pipe, and different clothing. You're coming out and together. And we had the Grateful Dead's Casey Jones playing underneath the thing, like driving that train high on.
That's good.
And we had some fun with it, but we did provide the full 36 hours of video. And what the lawyer ended up doing was he said, Your Honor, I'm going to show you. Actually, it was a mediation situation. And they got the guy on the record saying, I'd never do this. I would never do that. I would never do this. And then he went and showed the highlights reel and said, I've got 36 hours. Do you want to continue with this? And they settled right then. So, to answer Jason's question, yeah, you can use, and I don't know if you use a PC or a Mac. Scott's a Mac guy. I'm a total Mac guy. We've got Macs in the entire office here. Let
me just say that I will never go back after discovering Mac. And Mac had issues years ago where it made it very difficult to deal in business with anyone that wasn't using a Mac. Now it's not a problem. But in terms of video quality, I'll never go back to PC. The Mac is just superior in my opinion.
No doubt about it. And I've got a MacBook Air that I've had for maybe 8 years. I don't know when they first came out. I got it when they first came out, and it still runs. It still works. And if it were to die, I would weep. I would cry because I love this one.
Back it up.
Yeah, totally. So we've covered kind of the rural, suburban, urban surveillance. There's a type of surveillance that I've really enjoyed doing this kind of work, and it is the foot surveillance, the foot mobile surveillance. Do you do any of that kind of work? Do you have occasion to do foot mobile where you're like following someone on foot through a town?
I do. I've followed people to historical sites where they've gotten out of the car, parks, things like that, hiking, the mall, those types of issues. And you really got to be prepared for any scenario. Typically, if I'm going to follow somebody like that, I bring a hat, and I just try to be the world's most boring human that is not noticed. and sometimes I'll have to change shirts afterwards, just to try to so they don't remember me, so to speak. And I use my cell phone, like the covert camera, which can be used in almost every situation. So it's difficult. You have to follow behind the person and keep an eye on them, because you can even lose somebody on foot, which is embarrassing, but it does happen.
Oh, it totally happens. And we just got a question from the audience, and I think this is a valid question. I have an answer for it. I will give my answer, Scott, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. The person asks for tips for camera shake on moving surveillance. My experience has been, you get the best quality video you can, but at the end of the day, if you're getting the evidence, the client doesn't matter if it shakes. They don't care if it shakes a little bit. Scott, do you deal with that? Do you address it in any way up front?
I do. I let them know in my retainer agreement that the video that they're going to receive is not television production style video. Okay, we're not going to have. It's not going to look like it is. I can't tell you how many times I say this. What we do, it's not like it happens on television. It can be very difficult. And so it really depends. In high school years ago, I was in band, and so we would have to march. And what you do is you kind of roll the balls of your feet, and you have to consciously do this. As you hold the keychain camera, you hold your arm out, and you just kind of roll on the balls of your feet and try to glide smoothly, and that will prevent some of the shaking. But when it comes down to it, some video, in most cases, is better than no video, even if it is a little shaky.
Yeah, and for those of you who are in the business, and for those of you who are new to the business, there are a lot of times when if you're in a vehicle doing surveillance, you might actually be pointing the camera at the side view mirror or the rear view mirror and getting evidence that direction. Any of it works. The video quality doesn't matter as much as we would like to think it does as professional investigators. You got to get the best you can, but if you get the person doing the thing they're not supposed to be doing, and you can say, I shot this through the rearview mirror, so the image is flipped on this video. You can say that, and you can prove that up in court, and it holds up just fine. Scott, I think at this point, we've got 5 minutes left, and I really want to hear about your new book. As Stephanie said earlier when we were talking, I'm excited to read it. I have not gotten a copy of it yet, and I'm kind of sad about that. But take a few.
Well, you can get one.
And tell me where I get one. Where do I go to get a copy of the book?
So the book is Confessions of a Private Eye, My 30 Years Investigating Cheaters, Frauds, Missing Persons, and Crooks. And you can find it at Amazon.com. Right now, you go to Amazon and just type in Confessions of a Private Eye. It is available in trade paperback as well as ebook. And if you are a member of Kindle Unlimited, I think you can get the ebook for free right now. It's about 256 pages, and it basically covers my story, I guess, and many of the investigations I've conducted. It kind of grew out of writing articles and blogging and podcasting, and I would be on an airplane and tell people, what I do, and everyone always said the same thing. You really ought to write a book. And so I thought, that sounds like a great idea, and I started to put everything together. And it took me about a little over a year. And I would say the writing part was easy, but the editing and the re-editing was actually physically painful. I hated doing that part. But it's gotten pretty good reviews. It opens up with a kidnapping case that I worked, a child kidnapping case. I talk a little bit about growing up, but it's appropriate for the book. And then I spent a lot of time, the rest of the book, basically talking about the private investigation industry, all the case work I've done. And of course, all the names and details are changed to protect the innocent and the guilty. Mm-hmm. But I think it's enjoyable. It's humorous. And I think that it doesn't make me out to be some kind of a saint or know-it-all. I talk about losing people. I talk about mistakes I've made along the way. And I think it's something that you can learn a lot from.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to get to. My understanding of the book, having kind of looked at the reviews and stuff like that, is it's an entertaining book for someone who's not in the PI business, but for private investigators, it can be educational. There's some good information. There's some tips and tricks in there that you can use. And my thing is, as a private investigator, I've talked about this on a number of occasions, but I have this thing that I do at the end of every year where I write the kind of year-end wrap-up, what happened to me this past year, things I've learned. And for the past 6 years in a row, I've started that list off with some variation of the older I get, the more I realize I don't know anything. And I think
Yeah.
I like that feeling. It makes me feel good to know that I've got so much more to learn. But part of that process is picking up books, picking up information, reading stuff that your fellow PIs have put out there, stuff like that. It's really useful from a professional development standpoint. And we got Stephanie. Stephanie, the manager of PI Education, just said in the text string here, she said, "I want an autographed copy."
We can arrange that.
Very good. Well, Scott, it looks like we're getting right down to the end here. I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to push PI Education one more time. This is the PI Education monthly webinar for March 2018. I'm Hal Humphreys, your host. I've been joined today by Scott Fulmer, PI out of Utah. We promised you a promo code. I gave it to you to the half-hour mark. Again, the promo code is COVERT. If you go to pieducation.com and select any course on there you would like to take, key in the promo code COVERT, one word, all lowercase, and we'll give you 15% off of whatever course you want to buy. If you want to buy 10, we'll give you 15% off of every one of them. pieducation.com. Also, don't forget to check out Pursuit Magazine. I know Scott has an article that Kim Green is really anxiously awaiting from him on, I think the topic is garbology, which is something that most of us private investigators understand as dumpster diving, or grabbing the trash from someone's house or business and going through it and finding all kinds of crazy information. And finally, this podcast, or this webinar, is done once a month. It's on our YouTube channel. On the bottom right-hand side of your YouTube screen, there's a subscribe button. Go ahead and click that now. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to have you be a subscriber. Scott, thank you so much for joining me today, man. I really appreciate it. I think it was a really good webinar.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Okay. You guys have a great afternoon. That ends the PI Education webinar for March 2018. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.